Eddie Chavez Calderon here with Ariel Lavi. So happy to bring in another engaging conversation with us today. Thank you for all of you for joining our class today. We have a great speaker here today with Rabbi Aharon, who is a serial social entrepreneur and a professional community organizer who believes that networks are a key to shaping our reality. I'm going to go ahead and hit the record button here real quick. Hello, everybody. Eddie Chavez Calderon here with some double feedback. There we go. Rabbi Aharon is a co-founder of Makom, a national umbrella of the Organization of Unintentional Communities in Israel, and founder of General Director of Hakel, the Jewish the Jewish International Communities Incubator of in the diaspora. Rabbi Aharon is also a thinker who believes Judaism can inspire and inform all walks of life and vice versa. He holds a rabbinic Shmitah as well as an academic degree in economics, geography, history, and philosophy of ideas, trained as an economist, a historian of ideas, and writes his dissertation of migration of ideas between U.S. Jewry and the Israeli society. He was a fellow in 7 research institutions in Israel and wrote extensively on Judaism and economic environmentalism and other issues. He lives with his wife, Layat, and their 5 children in Shuva. And on his spare time, he is also a professional mountain biking racer and trainer. Wow, that's really, what don't you do, Rabbi? His recent book, 7 presented.
That's the fun part, you know?
That's really cool. Inspired economics on social and environmental ideas. It's a pleasure to have you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. So good evening. For me, it's evening already. Good afternoon, everybody. Eddie, maybe you just give me the ground rules. Should I just give a lecture? Do you want to be more of a conversation, questions? How would you like this to?
Lecture with questions at the end, please.
Okay. And we have about 50 minutes, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So hello, everybody. As Eddie said, my name is Aharon Ariel Lavi. I live in Israel. And one of the issues I'm most preoccupied with in the last 7 years or even more is the Shmitah year, the sabbatical year, Shvi'it, which is one of the most radical and deepest concepts we have in Jewish literature, Jewish ideas, Jewish philosophy. But for many years, it was actually quite neglected because it applies mostly in Israel, the land of Israel. Most people don't really deal with that. Even people who live in Israel some of them are not even aware that we are in a Shmitah year. It ends in 5-6 weeks, but we are still in a Shmitah year. And let alone what it means and what are its key concepts and what can be, if at all, its applications to modern economy and modern society. So in this talk, I would like to actually do a brief overview of Shmitah, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Don't want to assume any prior knowledge, so it's going to be quick, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what is Shmitah, basically. Then we'll try and drill in and understand a few of its key concepts that relate to crisis, to economic cycles, to freedom, to justice, and a few other ideas. And then we'll sort of like climb back up in time to our era, to our generation, and see how those key core ideas can be applied to the modern economy and modern society. We're trying to avoid fundamentalism. So I'm not going to suggest that we need to shut down the market for a whole year, every 7 years, because that's what our ancestors did in Israel, like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I'm going to try and hopefully be a bit more nuanced and complex and try to see where those ideas can actually apply in a way that makes sense to our society and economy. So let's dive right in. So first of all, what is Shmitah? Again, very briefly, just to give you an overview and to make sure that we're all on the same page about it. First of all, the word Shmitah in Hebrew, it means to let go, to release. Shmot, something is to drop it or to let it go or to release it. So Shmitah is about release. We'll see in a minute of what exactly. Now, Shmitah is also called Shvi'it, which comes from the number 7, which is actually it is the number 7 in Hebrew, and quite interestingly, in Hebrew and English, those numbers sound very similar, 7 and Sheva. But in any case, so it's called Shvi'it because this is the 7th year of a 7-year cycle. So we count 6 regular years, and then the 7th year is a Shmitah year. And in the Shmitah year, we have a few very exceptional mechanisms that come into play. So we're going to start with the theory, and then we're going to discuss a bit if and how, to what extent those things were actually exercised or implemented in history. But just to give us the concepts first. So the first piece of Shmitah is really the Shabbat ha'aretz, Shabbat of the land, where we are supposed to leave the land fallow, give it a rest. We're not allowed to plow, to plant new plants or trees, to put seed in the ground, and all the produce that grows out of itself that year, not out of itself, actually the result of the prior 6 years that we have prepared towards Shmitah, everything that grows on that year is actually ownerless. Ownerless means hefker in Hebrew, means that it's not owned by anyone, and anyone can take it. So, not just to, I just said that Shmitah is a radical idea. Just try to think about it. So you as a farmer, you invest 6 years in plowing and planting and pruning and everything you need to have a nice orchard of lemons or whatever it is that you grow. And all of a sudden, when the sun sets on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year, of the Shmitah year, those lemons are not yours anymore. They belong to everyone, including to the animals. And anyone can walk into your field and take not as much as they want. They can take enough for 1 or 2 or 3 days. So no one can take the whole field, neither you. People can take as much as they need for a few days substance. So that's one key idea of Shmitah, the Shabbat ha'aretz. The second key idea is debt release, monetary Shmitah or Shmitat ksafim, letting go of funds, literally. Which means that at the end of the Shmitah year, after we left the land fallow for a whole year, so at the end of the Shmitah year, all the debts, not exactly all the debts, but some kinds of debts, we won't go into all the details now, actually get released or canceled. So, Eddie, if I lend you money sometime during those 6 years or during the Shmitah year, and you haven't paid me back for some reason, comes the end of the Shmitah year, and that's it. I'm not allowed to ask you to pay me back. I'm not allowed to remind you even about it. That doesn't exist. You can still pay it back if you want to be a more righteous man or to fulfill your duties. But even then, you need to tell me that you're giving me this money as a gift, not as a payment on the loan, because the loan doesn't exist anymore. It's been released. It's in Shmitah. It's been dropped. So that's the second thing. Then we have, after the Shmitah year, we have what we call Hakel. Hakel comes from the word community. It's also the name of the project that I manage. Hakel literally means it's an imperative. It's to create a community or to gather the people. So after we left the land fallow for a whole year, we released all the debts on the last day of the Shmitah year. Then on 2 weeks later, on Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, in the 8th year, the beginning of the next cycle, we celebrate Hakel, which means that everybody, again, in theory, would come to Jerusalem. All ages, young, old, men, women, everybody would come to Jerusalem to celebrate our nation as a community. So these are the 3 basic things of Shmitah itself in the Shmitah year. And then on top of that, there's another idea which even goes farther and deeper and is even more radical and more challenging, which is called the Yovel. Yovel meaning the Jubilee. Now the Yovel is the 50th year. Why? Because we count 7 cycles of 7 years. That's 49 years. So the 49th year is a Shmitah year. And then the 50th year is also a Shmitah year. And on top of that, we have 2 Shmitah years in a row, which is a bit tough, not to work the land, again, in an agricultural society for 2 years in a row. But on top of that, we have 2 more things happening in the Yovel. One is that all the slaves are being released. They have to be released. And the second is that all the lands are to be returned to their original owners. So if, I had a piece of land at the beginning of those 50 years, and I sold it to Jessica, and Jessica sold it to Nick, and Nick sold it to Eddie, and whatever. So all those transactions are being tracked and monitored. Comes the end, the Yom Kippur on the 50th year of the Yovel, Eddie needs to give me back my land, which is swapped no matter how many hands. It goes back to me free of charge. And if anyone is a slave, again, back then slavery was unfortunately a common practice. All the slaves are to be released, which is also a pretty genuine idea in the economy of the time. So these are the few basic elements of Shmitah. There are a few more that relate to private property and the cycle of redemption. We might get to them later, but these are the core pieces. The Shabbat living the land follow, monetary Shmitah, releasing and canceling all the debts, Hakel, gathering as a community at the end of the Shmitah year, and Yovel, Jubilee, which means, which implies releasing all the slaves and returning all the lands to their original owners. So, Eddie, I'm going to continue without questions. What questions we'll take at the end? So, the question is, what was Shmitah like? So, when I do this usually in a room with people, and we start like asking, okay, so how would Shmitah look like, and how would people feel? So some people relate to Shmitah as a very positive, maybe even utopian year, and some relate to it as maybe a very challenging year. So I would like to briefly share a few sources that relate to Shmitah. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to read them out loud, so those of you who are only listening can also take part in the conversation and the learning. And we're going to try and take a look at a few perceptions on Shmitah, and then try and, as I said, drill down and ask, okay, so what is it actually? And what's going on there? And how can we, what are the key ideas underlying Shmitah? So I want to start with this piece from Rav Shaul Mortira. He's, I assume not too many people know him. He was actually a very interesting guy. He was a rabbi of Baruch Spinoza, 16th century in Amsterdam. And he wrote the following. He, like many rabbis over the ages, he wrote a book on the weekly portions. And this is a short excerpt of what he wrote on Parashat Bahar, which is at the end of Leviticus. That's where the core of Shmitah appears. The other part of Shmitah, by the way, the monetary Shmitah, appears this week, Parashat Re'eh in Deuteronomy. So these are the two main places where Shmitah appears, and there's another verse in Shmot where it's just mentioned for in one verse. So he says the following: for they're abandoning everything in the year of the Shmitah, meaning when we all leave everything, we leave the land fallow in the Shmitah year, and all the debt, to the cattle and the beast is a sign of what was and will again be. For no longer will they eat bread by the sweat of their brow, and the wild animals will not harm the cattle. He's alluding to the sin in the Garden of Eden, and to the curse actually after the Garden of Eden that we have to walk the land. But he's also alluding to Isaiah's prophecy about this peace that will rule the earth one day, that not only men will be and humans will be in peace among themselves, but even the animals will not harm one another anymore. And he says, continues, so therefore, whoever observes the mitzvot which signify this will be privileged to experience all of these things. And there's another piece by Kli Yakar, another very important commentator. I'm going to read it from the middle. So he says, the year of Shmitah promotes a sense of fellowship and peace. So he also alludes to Shmitah as a very genuine, a very utopian idea. For one is not allowed to exercise over any of the seventh year produce the right of private ownership. As we said, all the fruits, those lemons that I worked so hard on, are not mine anymore in the Shmitah year. And this is undoubtedly a primary factor in promoting peace, since most dissension originates from the attitudes of mine is mine, meaning one person claiming it is all mine, and the other also claiming it is all mine. But in the seventh year, in the Shmitah year, all are equal. And this is the real essence of peace. So he alludes to the concept of letting go of property or private property in the Shmitah year. And there are many more commentators like this. Now, what's common to many of them is that they didn't live in the land of Israel. And I'm not criticizing any of them. I'm not anywhere near their level in Torah scholarship and righteousness. I'm just setting the fact that many of those commentators lived in Europe or other places in the Middle Ages. And when you look in earlier sources, in the Talmud that writes about the Shmitah year, in some external sources, such as the writings that we have from the Roman period, you can see that actually Shmitah was not such a fun year. It was actually a very, very tough year. I wanted just to make it more vivid, make it more lively, by telling you a story of how one halakha, one Jewish law actually evolved, which tells the story of how difficult Shmitah was. So basically, one of the rules of Shmitah says that if I have a field, obviously I'm not allowed to plow the field or plant anything during the Shmitah year. That's obvious. But I'm also not allowed to prepare the field for plowing and planting next year. So, for example, I'm not allowed to clean the field from rocks and stones and branches, just in order so it will be easier and more quicker for me to plow it right after Rosh Hashanah in the 8th year, after the Shmitah year ends. Now, this is very similar to Shabbat, for example, that you're not, for example, it's allowed to cut vegetables for a salad on Shabbat. But if you do it to prepare for cooking them after Shabbat, that's not allowed. It's about preparation. Now, on the other hand, it is permissible to take the rocks out of your field if you need them to build a house, for example, which is allowed on Shmitah. So this is a very key concept of Jewish law in general, that just as a side note, that many laws in Jewish law in halakha actually relate to the intention, to the kavanah, to the state of mind of the actor. So if your intention, while externally it can look the same, when one person picking rocks out of his field, the intention matters. If the intention is to clean the field, to plow it right after Shmitah, it's not allowed. If it's to build a house because you need just the rocks because that's the local material you have, it is allowed. Okay, so far so good. So the Talmud says in Masechet Shvi'it, in the tractate that deals with all the laws of Shmitah, it says that what people started to do is actually either build many houses, or even worse than that, they started taking the rocks and just saying that they needed to build a house without building a house. So it was actually a loophole, and people took advantage of that loophole to clean their fields. So the sages came up with another rule to try and block this loophole. So they said, okay, we see what you're doing. So from now on, we're going to allow you to take rocks if you need to build a house only from your neighbor's field, not from your own field, only from someone else's field. Now, the reasoning behind it is that they assumed that no one will have an incentive to actually clean somebody else's field if they don't really need to build a house. Now, the problem is that they still have the loophole open. I can see your smile, Nick, because do you want to suggest what do you have in mind? What would you do?
Yeah, because I'll make a pact with my neighbor. You clear my land, I'll clear your land.
Exactly. I see you have a Talmudic mind. So that's exactly what people started doing. They started doing, in Hebrew, in Israel, we call this a kombina, which comes from the word combination, but it has a very negative meaning in the Israeli context. I don't know if negative. It's a mischief, okay, in English, basically. So that's exactly what people started doing. So they started making those contracts that I clean your field, you clean my field, and at the end of the day, we have a clean field, and we said that it's for building a house. And then there's a story. I mean, the end of the story is that Rabbi Akiva was walking around the land, as was his custom. You know what? Maybe I'll just share it again so you can see what I'm referring to. Those who are watching us. So the whole story is here. If anyone wants the full source sheet, I'm happy to send it to you. And I'm reading these lines. So Rabbi Akiva was performing his investigation of people's observance of Shmitah, as was his custom. So like today, we have like Beit Din or a kashrut committee that would go around and see if people are abiding to the laws of kashrut or not. So Rabbi Akiva was like in this ancient kashrut committee. He would walk around the land to see if people are keeping Shmitah or not. He saw a person pruning his vineyard. So in this case, it's not collecting rocks, it's pruning the vineyard, but it's the same idea. You can prune the vineyard if you need the branches for something else, but not for the benefit of the vine itself, not for the benefit of the plant itself, of the tree. He said to him, so Rabbi Akiva tells this man, is it not forbidden to do so on Shvit? Like, don't you know you're not allowed to prune the vineyard on the sabbatical year? The farmer said to him, I need the vines to use as netting for an olive press. So he needed them as weights, actually, just to press, back then, how do you produce olive oil? People actually use this to this day. First of all, you crush the olives a bit, then you put them in a basket and you just put heavy weight on the basket. And from the weights, it takes a few days, but all the oil is squeezed from the olives, you collect them, and that's how you get olive oil. So he says, it tells Rabbi Akiva, I just need something to press the olives to make oil. Rabbi Akiva said to him, actually, Rabbi Akiva gives up at this point. He does not come up with a new rule. He does not try to close the loophole again. And he says, the heart knows whether your intent is for netting or for perversity. Then in Hebrew, if you can see it up here, it says, Halev yodea im la'akal kalot. So in Hebrew, it's a very beautiful play of words. Akal is the basket, akal kalot is this kombina, mischief, this misbehavior. But in any case, the idea is that Rabbi Akiva actually gives up and he says, that's as far as I can go as a legislator and a law enforcement force, so to speak. I can't judge, I can't investigate what's going on in your heart. I can only see what you do externally. And from this point on, I'm going to leave it to your own discretion. And it's up to you whether you act properly or not. I'll leave it to you. It's your heart, it's your jurisdiction. And with this, the story ends. Now, this story can tell us a lot about the relationship between the Chachamim, the Rabbanim, the rabbis, and everybody else, the masses. It can tell us a lot about authority, about loopholes, about halakha, about the intention of the heart. We can use this story for many, many purposes. I want to take one point relevant to us, to this conversation, which is the example of how difficult it was to keep Shmitah. And evidence is that people try to bypass Shmitah all the time. And if you read the entire tractate, if you study the entire tractate of Shvi'it in the Talmud Yerushalmi, you can see that a very large proportion of that tractate, disproportionate to other tractates, compared to other tractates, is dedicated not to how to keep Shmitah. It actually deals with what can we do about those who do not keep Shmitah, about those who are trying to game the system, those who are trying to use all the loopholes, those trying to bypass Shmitah. How can we actually deal with them? Which is an example of how tough it was to keep Shmitah. We can also see it in some Roman writings that we have from the area. We can see, for example, Sefer Maccabim, which is not Roman, it's from the Greek period, that tells how tough it was to keep Shmitah, and how people barely had anything to eat during the year of Shmitah, which was also the year of the rebellion of the Chashmonaim, the Chasmonites. There are many other places that show it was a very difficult year. Now, with this in mind, I want to start diving deeper and ask Eddie, Nick, Craig, I see also online. If you want to answer, that's great. If not, I can try and give the answers I usually get in this session. You in principle, our Torah, our tradition, our thought tradition is about making the world a better place. It's not about making people miserable. It's not about torturing people. It's not about making people go hungry. Yes, we have a few fast days over the year, but it's like one day. It's not too bad. We have Shabbat, which is a constraint, but it also has lots of benefits that we get together as a family and we get to have some rest. We have the laws of kashrut, which are also a constraint, but they don't make you miserable. Okay, they don't make you suffer. It's a constraint, but you get some benefit because it creates a sense of belonging, it creates a spiritual meaning, creates many positive things. Now, my question would be, why would our Torah impose something such as Shmitah, which is tough, which is people went hungry, people were devastated, they were terrified, they're living in uncertainty. Why do that? Why actually inject Yannick?
Well, I'm just thinking like, okay, so God made Shabbat and we are meant to emulate God and rest on Shabbat. Maybe the earth is supposed to emulate God and rest on the Shmitah year? Is that?
Well, yeah, first of all, that's a good answer, because if you read the verses themselves, so Shmitah is compared to Shabbat many times. First of all, this idea of 7, it's also called Shabbat Haaretz, the Shabbat of the land. Yeah, it's definitely tied to Shabbat in many ways. But what else? What can be the benefit in a crisis? If we take this line of interpretation of Shmitah as a crisis, not necessarily as a utopia. What can be the benefit of a crisis?
Well, I'm just relating it to Sukkot, for instance, where Sukkot, we're meant to remember that our homes are not permanent. Nothing is permanent on earth, right? And is the
Right.
Shmitah year similar to that? Like, we can't always expect the land to produce everything for us. We need to make preparations for the possibility of calamities, of famine, of war, you know, like, is it meant to teach us this, like being prepared?
Yeah, I think beautiful. Actually, what you said alludes and connects also to last week's parasha, 3 days ago. Okay, Parashat Ekev. So it tells about the land of Israel. I mean, there are many things there, but one of the few of the verses talk about the land of Israel and how great it is, and how beautiful it is, and how much water it has, and how much natural resources it has. Now, I live in Israel, okay? I was born in Israel, I grew up in Israel, I was a tour guide, I was in the military, I still serve in the military. I know this, it's a very small country, I know it inside out, I know every hiking trail, every natural reserve, every lake and stream and river. And when I read those verses, my reaction is, come on, this is not, I mean, Israel is beautiful, but it's not a land of flowing water and streams and natural resources. I mean, it's the only corner in the Middle East that does not have oil. It's the only corner that does. Yes, we found some gas in the sea. Yeah, it's a very small amount relatively. I mean, come on, this is not the land of Israel. What are you talking about? And then it goes even worse than that. Again, worse just as a figure of speech, just to make the point. At the end of the parasha, it says the land of Israel is actually better than the land of Egypt. It's actually good for us to leave the land of Egypt and go to the land of Israel. Because in Egypt you need to water the plants. It says you need to do legwork to irrigate the fields. While in Israel, the rain falls and everything gets irrigated automatically. But again, yes, we had 3 years of nice rains in Israel, but before that we had 6 years of drought. The Bible itself, it's not about climate change. I mean, it's becoming worse, but 3,000 years ago, Abraham had to leave the land because there was famine, there was a drought. Isaac as well. Then he didn't leave, but he almost left. Jacob, this is like generation after generation. Every 10, 15, 20 years, you have a drought and a famine in the land of Israel. So how can it be better than Egypt, which was the home of the largest empire of the time?
Yeah.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah. I was thinking from an agricultural point of view, I think Shmitah is pretty smart because it helps alleviate the tension of continuous cultivation for years and years on. It allows for a better standing for maybe the ground to have peace and some of those minerals to come back into the agricultural region. I know a lot of the native communities, the way they would cultivate is that they would move their crop areas from one area to the other and leave one area alone. So I'm thinking like if Shmitah goes into full effect where folks, I guess like today in modern age, I know it works differently, but back then agriculturally it would really make sense, because then the next year all those minerals are back in the soil and it
Right.
produces a better flow of food.
Right. So yeah, we'll get to this also in a minute because that's another idea. But it's also simple because why do it everybody at once? Now, just to close off that idea, so the difference between the land of Israel and Egypt is that the benefit of being in the land of Israel is that you have a connection to God. God speaks to you through the amount of rain, you get to know that. So going back to what you also said, Nick, so Shmitah in a way teaches us, educates us that nothing is to be taken for granted in this world, like the Nile in Egypt. It's taken for granted, like you don't need any connection to God, you just have the Nile. In Israel, you need to have this relationship. So Shmitah sort of like forces you into this stress and crisis to cultivate this relationship, maybe even to do some sort of a test of faith. Now, there are also more earthly reasons. Like you said, Adi, today we know to explain it biologically, that for example, all kinds of minerals and nitrogen, if you cultivate the land again and again, you plant the same crops again and again, they get depleted and the productivity actually falls over time. Now, farmers in ancient times, well, they didn't know to explain this the way we explain it, with all the fancy names and fancy minerals. But they could just see that if you plant the same thing again and again and again, the productivity falls down or drops down. Now, the way to solve it is actually, like you said, so sorry. So this is sorry, just a second. Now, what people in ancient times would do is to rotate the fields and leave every piece fallow at a different time. Now, the challenge of Shmitah is that we all do it at the same time for all the lands. Now, by the way, the same goes for monetary Shmitah, for the Shmitat Ksafim. Okay. So one thing that a lot of people don't know is that actually this idea was not originally just a Jewish idea. Many rulers in the ancient times used to do clean slates. Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Assyrian kings would do clean slates. They would release all the debts in their country. Now, the reason they would do that wasn't because they were such nice people or philanthropists. The reason they would do it is that what would happen over a course of several years is that, for example, if I lend you money, Eddie, and you fail to pay it back because there was a drought, because you didn't manage your finances correctly, whatever, for whatever reason, you don't pay it back and you default, the recourse, the collateral against the loan I gave you is your land. So if you default, I take your land as a recourse. And if that's not enough to actually pay back the loan, I take you as a slave, sometimes your entire family. Now, we have written evidence from Babylon and other places like 3,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that people actually sold their mothers into slavery to cover their debts. Now, why the mother? Because if the father passed away, so your mother is a widow. And widows back then had no rights. That's what the Torah, and again, we're in Uri Tzedek, we're talking also about justice. Sometimes, we tend to read those verses as like, okay, yeah, we need to take care of the widows and the orphans. Okay, so what? But you need to put it in context, because back then, widows and orphans had no rights. They had no legal standing. That's why the Torah goes against the grain of the time and tells you that you have to provide for those people specifically, the most vulnerable people in your society. Now, what would happen over a few years is that if I lend you money, you default, and then I lend money to Nick, and he also defaults, more people default. After 5-10 years, me and a group, another small group of other people who are the lenders, who are the creditors, actually get to own most of the lands and even most of the people, like the story of Joseph. So it all gets concentrated. And then the rest of the people have no land and no freedom and actually no hope. Now, when the king wants to actually recruit an army to defend his country or to fight another king, so that's what kings used to do, no one would come. Because if your population has no hope, it's very difficult to motivate people who have no hope and have nothing to lose to do something. Because they would say, what are you going to do? Kill us? Okay, kill us. Like, we have nothing to lose anyway. We have no freedom, no means of production. No, we're not going to go on your wars and risk our lives. So they would proclaim a clean slate and return people, give people back their freedom and lands as a means to preserve their control over society. Actually, usually it would happen when a new king would come into rulership or the king's birthday. Now, this also explains Jubilee. Why Jubilee focuses on releasing slaves and returning the lands to their owners in order to reverse this cycle, to reset the system. That's the whole point behind Yovel. It's not just two random righteous things to do. But the big difference between the Jewish model and the model that was prevalent back then is that it's national and it's collective. It's all the lands at the same time. It's all the loans at the same time. It's all the slaves at the same time. And the most important point is it was expropriated from the hands of the king. So the king no longer has any say on when it's going to happen in other terms. It's all predetermined. It's like a constitution. And we can calculate from here to the end of time when exactly will be any Shmita year, debt release. We can calculate all of this in advance for all eternity. Now, beyond all that, I would like to offer one thought. Maybe just to wrap up what we said. So we talked about Shmitah as on one hand, it could be a utopian year. On the other hand, it can be actually a crisis. We chose to go with the other path of interpretation for this talk. And then we asked why have this crisis? And Nick, Eddie, you came up with some very good ideas. It's a test of faith. It brings us together. It helps us water the land to keep their productivity. And then we explain how it was all made collectively, and also actually taken out of the hands of the kings, which is, by the way, another very important like justice-oriented Jewish innovation, which is that everybody are equal in front of the law. This wasn't the case up until then. Kings were always above the law, and there was another legal system for all the rest. In our system, everybody are the same, under the same rules and regulations. Now, with this in mind, I would like to offer another thought, and then we'll take it back to our modern economy and modern society. Crisis has a benefit in and of itself, okay? Because crisis is actually the bearer of innovation, of entrepreneurship, of progress, actually. Because changes in society usually don't happen when everything is okay. Where people have a tendency for inertia, to just continue what they're used to do, not making any changes, not rocking the boat. When you have a crisis, that's when you have an opportunity to actually change things, to introduce new ideas, to implement new ideas. Those new ideas might have been around for a very long time, but no one really listened to them. When there's a crisis, that's when all of a sudden prime ministers and presidents go to the academia, to the professors, and ask them, do you have any idea on what to do about the inflation rate, or what to do about this economic crisis, or what to do about climate change, or what to do about any other crisis? They start looking for those ideas seriously only when the crisis hits, and not beforehand. And people knew about this economic crisis coming, people knew about climate change coming for a long time. By the way, economic crisis come in cycles roughly every 7 to 10 years. If you just think about the last 3 decades, 2001 and 2002, we had the dot-com bubble. Then 2008, we had the subprime crisis. It started in America. 2015, we had the fire engine stock exchanges and markets collapsed. And now 2022, we have this crisis. I'm not alluding there's something mystical here. I'm just saying that this cycle of 7 years is pretty much the time it takes for bubbles to build up and then they explode. And this happens in cycles again and again. Now, what you can achieve with a pre-planned crisis, with a crisis like Shmita, which is a pre-planned crisis, you know it's coming, you know the terms, you know how long it's going to last. So it's kind of similar to what you said earlier, Nick. What you achieve is two main things. A, you get the benefit of a crisis. You get this injection of innovation, entrepreneurship. People have to think out of the box. They need to prepare, they learn how to prepare to crisis. And also the other thing you get is to alleviate to some extent the frequency and the harshness or impact of unplanned crisis. Because if you know it's coming, then you're used to crisis, then when a surprise crisis hits you, you're more well fit to deal with that. Now there are many examples to exemplify, to make this more real. The one thing I like to use, and Eddie, you mentioned in the introduction that I'm a mountain biker. I do races, I do technical riding and instructions, and everybody who deals with mountain biking or cycling in general, or running, swimming, Ironman, all of what we call endurance sports, know that the most effective way to train, that has proven itself over the years, is what's called HIIT, H-I-I-T. That's high intensity interval training. Okay. Now the idea is that if you want to improve your fitness, and you go outside and just cycle as hard as you can until you drop dead, and then you do it again and again, that won't improve your fitness. That will actually deplete your resources. Your body won't be able to recover. At the end of the day, you will harm your fitness and lower it instead of improving it. The way to do it is, yes, you need to build a base first. You need to do some long rides and running, but that's basic. But to improve, you need to do those interval trainings. And interval training works in a way that it's pre-planned. You don't just go out and improvise. You have a plan that you get from your coach, or download from the web, or you plan for yourself. For example, it says, You do warm up, and then you do 5 minutes low intensity, then 2 minutes high intensity cycling, then 5 and 2, 5 and 2. There are many different variations of this. There are escalating pyramids, declining pyramids, all kinds of intervals. But the idea is that you make progress, you improve your fitness only when you push the limits a bit. Only in those 2 minutes of more intensive cycling or running or swimming than you're used to. That's when you actually improve your fitness. That's when you actually get this benefit. And then you need to calm down, let the body recover, and do it again and again and again. So as an allegory, I think this can also explain the idea behind Shmita. How we can actually, so to speak, train our society in pre-planned crises, in those pre-planned intervals. So we both get this like fitness benefit for our society, this resiliency of the society, these new ideas, this innovation. And we also get some immunity to unplanned crisis. Now, before we jump into our economy, I would just like to tie it all back into one last key idea of Shmitah, and then we'll see how it can apply to our generation, which is actually the idea of progress or of linear time thinking. So I want to start with just to stress the point. I'm going to give you a quick math quiz. Okay, Nick, Eddie, are you with me? It's not going to be too difficult. Okay, don't worry. If I give you the following series of numbers, I want you to tell me what would be the next numbers in this series, okay? So the series is 2, 4, 6, 8. What will come next after 8?
10.
10. And then?
12.
12, 14, right? It seems obvious. And it's correct. I'm not trying to trick you. It's a correct answer, okay? However, if we were to ask this question, going again back in time, ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon, Syria, some 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, some parts of Greece, the answer would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 6, 4, 2, because the mindset was cyclical. The mindset was about cycles that repeat themselves. Now, both answers are correct. You can build a function to produce the first series or the second one. Both are correct. It's about a paradigm. It's about a mindset. Now, what Shmitah did by actually detaching itself from the king's birthday or the king's or the day they came into power from those cycles, it became something independent that grows over time. So Shmitah and a few other key biblical ideas actually laid the infrastructure and the groundwork for the perception of linear time, okay, which was a huge revolution. Just try to think, what we know today as progress, as science, as innovation, it's all built on the idea of linear time instead of cyclical time. Now, if you know history, for example, then you know that the way they counted years back then wasn't continuous. Every time a new king came into power, they would start counting the years according to the new king. So it would be year 1 of King Cyrus, Koresh, and year 2 of King Cyrus. And when he died, it would be year 1 of his son, and again, because in cycles. What seems obvious to us that we count all the years. In our case, in the Jewish case, we count it from the creation of the world. In the Christian case, which is also the civilian case, we count it from the year 0 when Jesus was born. But in any case, we have this linear idea of time, this idea of progress, which I dare to say was put forward first by Moses and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, a few of the Hebrew prophets, who built a vision, a vision for hundreds and thousands of years into the future. Now let's try and take all of this together and see how it can somehow apply to our modern economy. So we have this idea of a pre-planned crisis, okay, that can sort of like encourage and catalyze innovation and entrepreneurship and progress, and also alleviate the harshness of unplanned crisis. And we have this idea of moving forward. And we also have this idea of Jubilee, which is preventing random changes from enslaving people for life. Okay, because we talked about this mechanism. So if I take a loan and for some reason I go into a problem and I can't pay it back, in ancient times, that's the end. I sell my land, I sell myself, and I'm a slave until the day I die. But Jubilee and also another part relates to Shmitah, which is the private slave cycle. That a Hebrew slave cannot be a slave for more than 6 years. They have to be released either after 6 years or the Jubilee, whatever comes first. So this idea is what it teaches us is that we want to build a society that, yes, on the one hand, we understand life happens, unplanned crises happen. Sometimes people take loans that are irresponsible and they can't pay them back. So there has to be some collateral, again, in the ancient mindset. Today we have other mechanisms in place for this. But on the other hand, we're not willing to live in a society where one random mistake or that might have nothing to do with you, it was just force majeure, something that happened without out of your control, will actually derail your life entirely and put you on a path for eternal slavery and bond service, and to become a bond servant until the end of your life and your family. Now let's try and use this idea to quickly observe some modern economic challenges that we have. So usually when I do this in a room, I ask people, so I'm just going to do this as a thought experiment. If people are, I would ask, like, who in the room above the age of 60 or 50 still working the same job that they started working on, let's say, 20 years ago? On average, most hands of the people above that age would rise. When I ask the same question of people under 40, no one would raise their hand. Even when I shorten the amount of time, okay, so who still works in the same job they worked in 10 years ago? Almost no one. 5 years, maybe a few. 2 years, that's when you get more hands in the air. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that in our generation, our age group, our millennials, Z-gens, this age group, which is now coming into age, we live in a very, very volatile job market. For good and for bad. People change jobs, they change positions, they change vocations very frequently. It has to do with globalization and technological changes and many other things. I won't go into all of this. I can just share one prediction that many economists agree on, is that the professions and vocations that our children are going to work in have not been invented yet. So we can't even prepare them to the future because we have no idea what the future is going to be like. I mean, just think about yourself. Like if someone would have told you 15 years ago or 20 years ago that one day there will be a profession, a full-time, very good paying job called a LinkedIn profiles editor, or a Facebook page manager, or a TikTok star or YouTuber. I mean, people can make millions on YouTube, and it's something that no one could foresee 20 years ago, and we have no idea what the future holds. We can know, for example, that bus drivers and taxi drivers are going to go out of job in about 10 years when autonomous cars become more stable and efficient. It's going to, when it happens, the change is going to be very, very quick, very drastic. So for many reasons, people lose their jobs or leave their jobs and move to another phase in life very frequently. It's going to intensify. Now, I would like to offer the following thought, that we can think of any one of those job transitions in the job market. We can think of each one of them as a crisis. Okay? On the one hand, it's great. It gives you, as an individual, a lot of flexibility and a lot of creativity and innovation. You can reinvent yourself. That's great. On the other hand, and we saw it on COVID. For example, people in the tourism industry that all of a sudden lost their jobs. It took them a year and a half, 2 years to recover. Many of them have still not recovered. Many of them moved to other jobs. They can't go back. Sometimes people get just thrown off the train in this crazy volatile job market. It's not everybody are able to do those transitions very efficiently and smoothly. So what if we take this idea of a pre-planned crisis And the idea of that we don't want random changes in the job market to derail people's lives. Yes, they won't become slaves because we don't have slavery anymore, Baruch Hashem, but they could become unemployed or underemployed, sometimes because reasons that were beyond their control. Not because they're lazy, because their profession become obsolete and no one saw it coming. It just happened one day. So why don't we take this idea of a pre-planned crisis and trying to keep people safe, at least to give them some recourse, some way out of those, if they get derailed, and try to apply it to the modern economy. Now, someone already tried to do that. His name was Charles Eliot. He was the president of Harvard University. And in 1880, he actually invented the sabbatical year that we all know to this day in the academia, in academic institutions. Now, the sabbatical year in the academia was 100% inspired by the biblical sabbatical year. It's 1 year every 6 years. But what he said and what other people said back then, other academic institutions that tried to mimic him, and then it spread out to the entire world, they said, it's not for the professor. It's not to give a long vacation to professors. It's for the institution. Because people go out for 1 year, it's a paid year, by the way, of course, it's not vacation. They get trained, they get better skills, and they come back to us as better teachers. So what if we take this idea, it doesn't have to be 1 year every 6 years, as I said in the beginning, we should be aware of fundamentalism. We're not trying to do copy-paste. We're trying to use the key ideas and use them as inspiration for the modern economy. What if we take this idea of a sabbatical year and expand it? Now, it doesn't have to be 1 year every 6 years. It can be 6 months every 5 years. It can be a personal cycle, not everybody together at the same time. But, and in my book, by the way, which was just want to show you a copy. So this is the book I just published called 7 Shmitah-inspired social and economic ideas. I also shared the link for it on Amazon on the chat. So the idea is, so in the book, I give a more detailed account and detailed proposal on how this can be done in some sort of an agreement between the employees, employers, and the government. I won't go into all the details now, but there is an option to come up with a model that actually enables people these transition periods. Again, these are not long vacations. Vacation is something else. These are transition periods for you to update your skills and upgrade and come back a better and more productive person for yourself and for society in general. You can come back to the previous job or move to another one, but it's a pre-planned crisis that enables you a more smooth transition to the next phase. Now, the question would be, and with this we conclude and leave a few minutes for questions if you want. The question would be, okay, so how are we going to fund this? Who is going to pay for those transitions? Which is a very good question that any economist should ask. Now, I don't think that's something that the government can or should fund. I don't think it's something that private philanthropists can or should fund. I think that who can fund this is us by ourselves. And the way to do it is actually use use another crisis that we have and try to solve it at the same opportunity. So we have another crisis in modern society, which is a good crisis, which is that we just live too long. I said this as a joke, of course. Those who are listening can see me sounding, and it's just to stress the argument. Obviously, it's great that we have a lot longer life expectancy. But the problem is that our retirement system and pension system and social security systems are not geared to support people for so many years after they retire. Actually, surveys in America show that there are more people in the United States who believe they're going to see aliens or meet UFOs, or meet aliens, than people who believe they're going to get something from the social security system. So it's going to go bankrupt in 2034, according to its own official data in the United States. That's tomorrow morning in historic terms. In Israel, it's 2044, a bit longer, but still not too far into the future. It's in our lifetime. So the solution most people propose is, okay, so let's just extend the retirement age. Let's retire at the age of 69, 70, and this way we can save the system. It's a viable solution economically, but I think that socially and from a human point of view, extending this period, working more and more years in a row just doesn't make sense. What could make sense is to take those sabbaticals, which are periods to freshen up and upgrade your skills and come back to the job market, and then pay them back at the end. So for example, if I take 5 periods of 6 months over the course of my working life, that's 2.5 years in total. So I would retire at the age of 69.5 instead of 67. Okay? This way, I give a response or some sort of a solution to the volatile job market, and I also respond to the crisis of retirement because I extend the retirement age, but without making it too unbearable for most people. So I would like to stop here. I know we're almost over the time. Eddie, let me know if you want to take questions or if I should share some remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can take like a couple of questions before we finish.
I have a quick question. Not about the Shmitah, but about the Yovel years. So if like this was your land, right? Like you 50 years ago, and you ended up selling it, but then you died and you had like 4 sons, and how does it make sense? Like, how would you figure it out? And not how to make sense, how would you figure it out? And then with population increases, would it just be like one family that keeps having ancestral control of a land?
Yeah, well, basically, yes. Basically, the land will stay at the hands of the same tribe and the same family. Again, in theory, as far as we know, Yovel was not really practiced in ancient times. It was way too challenging. But in theory, at least, the same family would keep the same land over years. You need to remember that back then, population growth was very minimal because most children died by the age of 5. So at the end of the day, you would have maybe 3 or 4 sons who can actually inherit your land. Okay, and also they marry to another family, so they inherit the land of their father. So it's complex. It was sustainable, but the idea is also there's a message here. There's a message of private property, but I think in a rectified manner. It says the property should be dispersed between everybody. Everybody should have a piece of the national wealth instead of all the national wealth going into one central place, as it used to be in the other nations around us. So the Yovel says once every generation, we're going to redistribute the land to make sure that everybody have private property and not only a very small amount of the population. So in this sense, Judaism is not socialist. It's not about public. Everything needs to be owned by the public and planned economy. I don't see any evidence for this in Jewish thought. But it's also not hyper-capitalist in the sense that let's just let the market do whatever it does, and if all the property ends in the hands of 1 of 10 families, then so be it. No, so there's some sort of a balance here. It's a private property-based society and economy, but it has some checks and balances to avoid overconcentration of wealth.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're at our time. We really appreciate you, Rabbi, for such an amazing class. Thank you so much for all of you who have been listening. This class will be available shortly tomorrow, a copy of the recording that you can hear on our YouTube, our learning library, and our podcast. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.